There is a strange moment that comes after a long marriage ends. The world stops asking what happened and starts asking what comes next. For Nicole Kidman, that moment arrived after nearly 20 years with Keith Urban. They met in 2005. They married in 2006. They built a home in Nashville. They raised 2 daughters. And for almost 2 decades, their lives became intertwined in a way that went far beyond the red carpet. Then in September 2025, Nicole filed for divorce. 4 months later, in January 2026, the marriage was officially dissolved. The court cited irreconcilable differences, while the couple reached agreements concerning their children and finances. And suddenly, a relationship that had occupied nearly 20 years of Nicole's adult life became a chapter that was over. But perhaps the most interesting question is not why did Nicole Kidman and Keith Urban divorce. There are plenty of headlines attempting to answer that question. Some rely on unnamed sources. Some offer theories. Some focus on Keith. Some focus on Nicole. Some try to reconstruct private conversations that the public was never actually part of. But there is another question. A quieter one. And perhaps a more revealing one. Who is Nicole Kidman now? Because when a marriage lasts 19 years, it does not simply disappear when the legal paperwork is signed. It leaves behind a family, a history, a way of life, children who still have 2 parents, memories that do not suddenly become meaningless, and a woman who has to decide what parts of that life she will carry forward. That is where Nicole's story becomes much more interesting than the divorce itself. Because Nicole has already experienced enormous changes in her life. She has been a daughter, a sister, a wife, a mother, a Hollywood actress, a woman who has lived through extraordinary professional success and deeply personal loss. She has already learned that life does not always follow the plan you make for it. And now, once again, the plan has changed. What makes this chapter particularly striking is the way Nicole has approached her family after the divorce. In March 2026, she spoke about being grateful for her family and keeping the family moving forward. She also made clear that there were things she did not intend to discuss publicly, saying that her priority was maintaining the family she and Keith had created. That choice tells us something, not necessarily about what happened inside the marriage. We should be careful there. It tells us something about what matters to Nicole now. Her daughters, their stability, their relationship with both parents, and the possibility of preserving a family structure even when the marriage itself no longer exists. That distinction is incredibly important, because divorce can end a marriage, but it does not erase parenthood. It does not erase 19 years of shared history. And it does not require every good memory to become a bad one. Nicole and Keith's daughters, Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret, are still connected to both of them. And their divorce agreement specifically emphasized that the children should continue to love both parents and feel comfortable in both families. That may be one of the most important details in their entire story. Because when adults separate, they often think about what they have lost. Children have to think about what their world will look like now. And Nicole appears determined to make that transition as stable as possible. Which brings us to something much deeper. Maybe the real story isn't about the woman who lost a husband. Maybe it is about the woman who refuses to lose the family. Those are not the same thing. A marriage can end. While love changes form, a relationship can change. While responsibility remains. And 2 people can stop being husband and wife, while still being parents together. That is a much more complicated story than a simple celebrity breakup. And perhaps it is especially meaningful for older viewers. Because after a certain age, you begin to understand that life is rarely divided neatly into winners and losers. People change. Families change. Children grow up. Priorities shift. Sometimes two people who once promised to spend their lives together discover that the life they imagined no longer exists. And then they have to decide what to do with everything that remains. Nicole has now entered that unfamiliar territory. She is no longer defining herself through a marriage that lasted nearly 2 decades. She is not starting over as the same woman she was in 2005. She is almost 60. Her children are growing into young women. Her career remains extraordinarily active. And the world is still watching. But perhaps for the first time in a long time. The question is not who Nicole Kidman belongs to. It is who Nicole Kidman chooses to be next. That is the story I want to explore. Not the rumors. Not the private accusations that cannot be proven. Not an imaginary conversation between two people we do not know personally. But the visible facts. The choices Nicole has made. The family she has protected. And the woman who emerges when a relationship that defined nearly 20 years of her life comes to an end. Because sometimes the most revealing chapter of a person's life begins. After the love story everyone else was watching has already ended. To understand what Nicole Kidman lost when her marriage ended, we first have to understand what she had built. Because Keith Urban was not simply a husband who appeared in Nicole's life and then disappeared from it. For nearly 20 years, he was part of the structure of her adult life. And that structure was much larger than a marriage certificate. There was a home. There were children. There were routines. There were careers. There were 2 countries constantly connected by work and family. And there was a version of Nicole that the public had come to recognize. The wife, the mother, the actress who could spend months filming in another country, and then fly home because her daughters needed her. That last part may be especially important now. In 2026, Nicole has spoken openly about the effort required to balance her career with motherhood. While filming Lioness, she reportedly made a point of flying home to be with Sunday and Faith, who are now teenagers. That tells us something about the life she had built. It was not a life where career simply came first. Nicole had reached a stage where her definition of success had become more complicated. A successful film was not enough. An award was not enough. A major role was not enough. There was another question waiting for her at home. Was she there for her children? That question became increasingly important as Sunday and Faith grew older. And it changes the way we should look at Nicole's marriage to Keith. Because when they married in 2006, neither of them was entering a completely empty life. Nicole already had a long history. Keith had his own. They were 2 established adults. 2 careers. 2 people carrying experiences that had shaped them before they met. But together, they eventually created something new. Their first daughter, Sunday Rose, was born in 2008. Their second daughter, Faith Margaret, was born in 2010 through gestational surrogacy. And suddenly, the center of their lives was no longer just the 2 of them. It was 4 people. A family. That changes everything. Because when 2 adults separate, they can theoretically walk away from the relationship. Parents cannot walk away from being parents. The children remain. The birthdays remain. The school years remain. The memories remain. And perhaps that explains why Nicole's attitude toward the end of her marriage has been so different from the way the media often approaches celebrity divorce. The headlines want a beginning and an ending. But families do not work that way. For Nicole, there is no clean ending. There is simply a new arrangement. The marriage is over. The family continues. And the daughters remain at the center. That is why it is important not to reduce Nicole's story to the question of whether she is moving on. She already has. In many ways, she has been moving forward for years. Her career continued. Her children grew. Her identity changed. And the woman who entered her marriage in 2006 is not the same woman who left it nearly 20 years later. She is older, more experienced, a mother of 4, an actress who has built an extraordinarily long career, and someone who has already experienced enough change to understand that life does not always follow the script you wrote for it. That may be why her recent comments are so revealing. In a 2026 interview with British Vogue, Nicole acknowledged that the future she imagined is no longer the future she has. She described their experience as something she did not expect, and said she now has to adjust and adapt because the future is unknown. That is not the language of someone trying to rewrite the past. It is the language of someone confronting the present. And there is an important distinction there. Nicole is not saying, "Everything was a mistake." She is saying, "My life is different now." Those are two very different statements. And perhaps that is the emotional heart of this story. We often assume that when a relationship ends, one side must have been wrong. But life is rarely that simple. Sometimes people grow in different directions. Sometimes circumstances change. Sometimes the future two people imagine together becomes impossible. And sometimes, the hardest thing is not accepting that love existed. It is accepting that love existed, and still wasn't enough to preserve the same life forever. Nicole's public reflections suggest that she is trying to approach this next chapter without pretending that she knows exactly where it will lead. She has described herself as moving forward with hope. Not certainty. Hope. That word matters, because certainty belongs to the past. She knew what her life looked like when she was married. She knew where she lived. She knew who her partner was. She knew the family structure. Now some of those answers have changed. The future is less defined. And yet, instead of presenting that uncertainty as the end of her story, Nicole appears to be treating it as an opening. A chance to discover what comes next. That becomes even more significant when you consider her age. Nicole is not 23. She is not starting adulthood. She has already lived several lives. The young Australian actress, the Hollywood newcomer, Tom Cruise's wife, the Academy Award-winning actress, the mother, the wife of a country music star, the producer, and now, a woman entering another chapter after a 19-year marriage. For younger people, starting again can sometimes feel like the beginning of life. For someone who has already lived through decades of fame and family, starting again means something else. It means carrying everything with you. The memories, the lessons, the children, the mistakes, their achievements, the losses. Nothing disappears. You simply learn to arrange your life differently. And that may be what Nicole is doing now. Not becoming a completely new person, but reorganizing the life she already has. Her daughters are still there. Her career is still there. Her relationship with her older children is still part of her story. Her connection to Australia remains. Her life in America remains. And even Keith Urban remains part of the family history they created together. That is why the image of a woman simply starting over is too simple. Nicole isn't starting from zero. She is starting from experience. And perhaps that is the difference between being young and being older. When you're young, the future feels like something you build from nothing. When you're older, you realize the future is built from everything you've already survived. And Nicole has survived quite a lot. She has experienced professional highs that few actors ever reach. She has experienced painful personal transitions. She has lived under an extraordinary level of public scrutiny. And through all of it, she continued working, continued parenting, continued changing, continued becoming someone slightly different from the person she had been before. So when the marriage ended, the real challenge was not simply losing Keith Urban. It was losing a structure around which almost 20 years of her life had been organized. And that is what makes the next stage so fascinating. Because now Nicole has to answer a question that has nothing to do with Hollywood, nothing to do with awards, nothing to do with box office numbers, nothing to do with who she might date next. The question is much simpler. What does a woman do when the life she planned is no longer the life she has? Nicole's answer, at least publicly, seems to be you adjust. You adapt. You keep your heart open. And you keep moving. But before we can understand where she is going, we need to understand the role Keith Urban once played in getting her there. Because the end of their marriage does not erase what came before it. And the story of those 19 years contains something important that is often lost when the headlines focus only on the divorce. Keith did not simply become Nicole's husband. For a significant part of her life, he became the person with whom she built a home, raised children, and faced some of life's most difficult moments. And understanding that history may be the only way to understand what this ending really means. When Nicole Kidman met Keith Urban, neither of them was looking for a fairy tale that the public could watch from beginning to end. They were two adults who had already lived complicated lives. Nicole had already become a major Hollywood actress. Keith had already established himself as a country music star. They came from different worlds, different industries, different backgrounds, and yet something connected them. They met in 2005. A year later, they married in Australia. At that point, nobody could know that the relationship would last nearly 2 decades. Nobody could know how many years they would spend building a family together. And nobody could know how deeply motherhood would eventually reshape Nicole's understanding of what mattered. That part of the story is important, because Nicole had already experienced motherhood before marrying Keith. She had adopted 2 children during her previous marriage to Tom Cruise, Isabella and Connor. But her life with Keith brought a different chapter. A new marriage, a new home, and eventually 2 daughters born into that relationship. Sunday Rose arrived in 2008. Faith Margaret followed in 2010 through a gestational surrogate. Suddenly, Nicole and Keith were raising young children together. And the center of their lives changed. Their careers were still enormous, but their family had become something neither career could replace. For Nicole, motherhood increasingly became intertwined with the choices she made professionally. She continued taking demanding roles. She continued traveling. She continued producing. But there was always another calculation. How long would she be away? Could she get home? What did her children need? That tension is something many parents understand. The difference is that Nicole had to negotiate it while working in an industry that constantly demanded her presence. A film might be shooting thousands of miles away. A television series might require months of production. Award season might pull her across continents. And Keith had his own career. Tours, concerts, recording, travel, long periods away from home. So their marriage was never simply about 2 people living quietly in the same house. It was a relationship built around movement. 2 careers that required them to be somewhere else. And a family that needed them to come home. 4 years, they appeared to find a way. They spoke publicly about making their relationship work. They talked about communication. They talked about family. And they continued to appear together at important moments. But there is something we should remember. A marriage does not become meaningful because it lasts a certain number of years. It becomes meaningful because of what happens during those years. And Nicole and Keith's marriage contained some extraordinary moments. There were professional triumphs. There were family milestones. There were periods when one partner supported the other through difficult circumstances. There were also ordinary years that the public never saw. School mornings, family dinners, birthdays, quiet evenings, the countless small routines that never make entertainment headlines. Those are often the years that actually make up a marriage. Not the red carpets, the ordinary days between them. And perhaps that is why the ending feels so significant. Because 19 years is not simply a number. It is an enormous amount of shared life. When a marriage ends after that much time, you are not just losing a spouse. You are losing a familiar version of everyday life. The person who was there for the small decisions. The person who knew the history. The person who understood the jokes. The person who had witnessed the children growing up. The person who knew what your life looked like before the public knew. That kind of history does not disappear because a judge signs a document. And Nicole seemed to understand that. Her public comments after the divorce did not suggest that she wanted to erase Keith from her story. Instead, she emphasized the family they had created. That choice matters, because there is a temptation, especially in celebrity culture, to turn a divorce into a competition. Who won? Who lost? Who moved on first? Who is happier? Who is responsible? But Nicole's situation is more complicated. She still has daughters who share a history with Keith. They still have memories of their childhood. And their father remains their father. Whatever happened between their adults, that relationship does not disappear. That is why Nicole's decision to protect the family structure may be more significant than any dramatic statement she could have made. She does not need the public to understand every detail. Her children need stability more than strangers need answers. And perhaps that is one of the clearest signs that Nicole has entered a different stage of life. Earlier in her career, public attention was part of the job. Now, some things are simply not for public consumption. There is a boundary, a line between what belongs to Nicole and what belongs to her daughters. That boundary may become increasingly important as the girls grow older. Sunday and Faith are no longer small children. They are teenagers. They have their own identities, their own friendships, their own understanding of the world. And they have grown up under an extraordinary level of public attention without actually choosing it themselves. That creates another responsibility for Nicole. She is not just deciding how to handle a divorce. She is deciding how to help her daughters navigate the consequences of that divorce. And that may be harder than anything the headlines reveal, because adults can understand the idea of separation. Children experience it differently. They may ask questions. They may feel divided loyalties. They may worry about what changes. They may wonder whether they are expected to choose a side. And a parent has to make one thing clear: you don't have to choose. You can love your mother. You can love your father. You can have a relationship with both. The end of a marriage does not require the end of a family. That principle appears to be central to Nicole's approach. And it is one reason why the public may never get the kind of explosive story it expects. Because the person with the most to gain from telling everything may have the least reason to do so. Nicole's priority is no longer simply her own reputation. She has children to consider. And once you become a parent, certain decisions stop being purely personal. You may want to explain yourself. But should you? You may have things you want to say. But will saying them help your children? You may know details that could change the public's opinion. But do your children benefit from strangers knowing them? Those are difficult questions. And they become even more difficult when millions of people are watching. Nicole has lived with that pressure for decades. She knows what happens when private life becomes public entertainment. She has experienced it throughout her career. So perhaps her restraint now is not weakness. Perhaps it is experience. She knows that once something is said publicly, it cannot be taken back. A headline can live for years. A quote can be repeated forever. A family, however, has to keep living after the headline disappears. That may be the difference between celebrity and adulthood. Celebrity asks, what will people think? Family asks, what will this do to the people I love? And Nicole is now facing the second question. That is also why the story cannot simply be about Keith. Yes, the marriage ended. Yes, the divorce became public. Yes, people naturally want to understand why. But Nicole's next chapter will be defined by what she does with the life that remains. Her children, her work, her relationships, her identity, her future. And there is another part of this story that deserves attention. Nicole's relationship with motherhood has not always been simple. Her family includes 4 children, and her experiences as a mother have unfolded across different periods of her life. That means she has already learned that family does not always fit neatly into one definition. Biological children, adopted children, children raised in different circumstances, a family spread across different places, a mother whose career has taken her around the world. There is no simple template, and perhaps that experience has prepared her in some ways for the uncertainty she faces now. She already knows that families change shape. She already knows that love can take different forms. And she already knows that the person you were at one stage of life may not be the person you become later. So perhaps the end of her marriage is not the end of the family story. It is another transformation. A painful one. An unexpected one. But still a transformation. And that brings us to the question that may define the next chapter. Nicole has spent much of her adult life being known through relationships. Daughter, wife, mother, actress, producer. Now she has to decide how all of those identities fit together without the marriage that once connected so many of them. Who is she when the role of wife is no longer part of her daily life? What does she want now? What does she protect? What does she let go? And perhaps most importantly, what does she choose to keep? Because after 19 years, there will be plenty she cannot take with her. But there is also plenty she can. The lessons, the memories, the children, the work, the love that existed, even if its form has changed, and the knowledge that a life can be rebuilt without pretending the old one never mattered. That may be Nicole Kidman's real challenge now. Not forgetting, not rewriting, but moving forward, while carrying the past with dignity. And before she can truly enter that future, there is one thing we need to understand. The woman walking into this new chapter is not the woman who married Keith Urban in 2006. She has lived nearly 20 more years. She has become a mother. She has changed professionally. She has changed personally. And she has learned that some of life's biggest decisions cannot be controlled. The divorce did not create that lesson. It simply made it impossible to ignore. There is a point in life when the question changes. When you're young, you ask, what do I want to become? Later, you start asking something different. What kind of life do I want to live? For Nicole Kidman, that second question has become increasingly important. Because the woman who married Keith Urban in 2006 was already successful. But she was not yet the woman she would become. She had not yet spent nearly 2 decades raising 2 daughters with him. She had not yet experienced all the professional changes that would follow. She had not yet reached the age where the future begins to look less like an open road, and more like a collection of choices. That is why the end of her marriage cannot simply be viewed as something that happened to Nicole. It also marks a moment when Nicole has to decide what she wants to carry forward. And that decision may have very little to do with romance. It may have much more to do with identity. For years, Nicole's public identity was easy to describe. She was an actress. She was a mother. She was Keith Urban's wife. She was one half of a famous couple. But those labels were never the whole person. There was always a woman underneath them. A woman who continued to work. A woman who continued to challenge herself. A woman who took roles that sometimes placed her in uncomfortable emotional territory. And a woman who, despite decades in the public eye, continued to evolve. Perhaps that is why her response to the divorce feels so different from the way celebrity culture usually handles endings. Nicole does not appear to be trying to manufacture a new identity overnight. She does not need to prove that she is happier. She does not need to immediately replace one relationship with another. And she does not need to convince the world that she never cared. Instead, she seems to be doing something much quieter. She is continuing to work, continuing to parent, continuing to live, continuing to look toward a future she admits she cannot fully predict. That sounds simple, but it isn't. Because when a relationship lasts almost 20 years, your identity becomes intertwined with another person's. You build habits together. You make decisions together. You organize your calendar together. You raise children together. You begin to imagine the future using the word we. And then suddenly, you have to learn how to use I again. Not because the other person never mattered, but because your life has changed. For Nicole, there is another layer. She has spent much of her life being watched. Every relationship becomes public. Every photograph becomes evidence. Every expression can be interpreted. Every decision can become a headline. And yet some of the most important decisions in her life cannot be explained in a headline. Motherhood is one of them. Nicole's daughters are now teenagers. That means she is not raising small children anymore. She is entering a different stage of motherhood. The years of constant physical care slowly become something else. Guidance, conversation, trust, knowing when to step forward and when to step back. And that transition happens at exactly the same time her own life is changing. So Nicole is not simply rebuilding her personal life. She is doing it while helping two young women navigate a major change in theirs. That requires restraint. It requires patience. And perhaps it requires putting their emotional needs ahead of the public's desire for answers. This is why her decision to keep certain things private becomes more significant. Privacy is often misunderstood. People sometimes think that when a celebrity refuses to explain something, they must be hiding something. But privacy does not necessarily mean secrecy. Sometimes privacy means understanding that not everything meaningful belongs to their audience. Nicole has spent decades giving the public pieces of her life through films, interviews, appearances, and photographs. But her children did not choose that level of attention. They were born into it. And now, as they become adults, protecting the boundary around their lives becomes increasingly important. That may be one reason why Nicole's public language has focused more on family than blame. Because whatever happened between their adults, the children still need a relationship with both. And that requires something that celebrity culture does not always reward. Maturity. It is much easier to make a dramatic statement. It is much harder to say less. It is easier to explain why you were hurt. Harder to accept that some explanations belong only inside a family. It is easier to ask the public to take your side. Harder to allow people to form their own opinions while you quietly protect the people you love. And perhaps Nicole understands that difference better than most. She has been famous for too long to believe that public opinion can solve private pain. The public moves quickly. Families do not. A headline may last 24 hours. A child's memory can last a lifetime. That is why the choices made now may matter far more than the stories circulating online. And there is another reason this moment is significant. Nicole has spent years portraying women who are forced to confront uncertainty. Women who lose control. Women who discover that the life they thought they understood is not what it appeared to be. As an actress, she has explored those emotions many times. But there is a strange difference between performing uncertainty and living it. Now, the future is not a screenplay. There is no director telling her what happens in the next scene. There is no guaranteed ending. She has to write the next chapter herself. And perhaps that is why her comments about adapting to an uncertain future matter. She cannot control everything that happens next. Nobody can. But she can control how she responds. She can decide what kind of mother she wants to be. What kind of relationship she wants to maintain with her former husband. What kind of work she wants to pursue. What parts of her private life she wants to keep private. And what kind of woman she wants to become from this point forward. That is where the story becomes bigger than Nicole Kidman. Because many people reach a similar crossroads. Not necessarily through divorce. Sometimes it happens after retirement. After children leave home. After the death of a parent. After a career ends. After a move. After a friendship disappears. After something you thought would last forever doesn't, and suddenly you are faced with a strange question. Who am I now? The answer is rarely immediate. You don't wake up the next morning with a completely new identity. You carry pieces of the old life with you. Some memories remain precious. Some become painful. Some simply become memories. And eventually, you learn that moving forward does not require destroying the past. That may be the healthiest way to understand Nicole's situation. The marriage ended. But the years did not become meaningless. The family remains. The children remain. The experiences remain. And Nicole remains. Perhaps changed. Perhaps wounded. Perhaps relieved in ways the public will never know. Perhaps uncertain. But still moving. And that is important because there is a temptation to treat divorce as failure. As if the only successful marriage is one that lasts forever. But 19 years of a shared life cannot be reduced to the word failed simply because the relationship eventually ended. A marriage can end without erasing everything that happened inside it. There can be gratitude alongside sadness, love alongside disappointment, memories alongside change. And perhaps that is what maturity looks like. Being able to hold two truths at the same time. Something mattered, and something is over. Nicole does not have to choose one truth and deny the other. She can acknowledge the life she had, and still build the life she wants next. That may be the most important lesson of this entire chapter. Because Nicole Kidman's story is no longer about trying to preserve an image of a perfect family. It is about preserving what is actually important. Her daughters, her dignity, her work, her sense of self, and their ability to move into an uncertain future without allowing the past to define every step. But there is still one question we have not fully answered. What happens to the love itself? Not the marriage. Not the legal relationship. Not the public image. The love. What happens to 19 years of affection, memories, family experiences, and shared history when two people are no longer husband and wife? Perhaps the answer is, it changes. And maybe that is something Nicole has already begun to understand. Because not every relationship survives in the form in which it began. Some become friendships. Some become co-parenting partnerships. Some become memories. And some remain complicated forever. But none of those possibilities automatically means that the years were worthless. The past does not need to be destroyed for the future to exist. And perhaps that is the quiet strength in Nicole's next chapter. She does not have to pretend she was never married. She does not have to pretend she was never hurt. She does not have to pretend that everything is fine. She simply has to keep living. And for someone who has spent her entire adult life under the gaze of millions, that may be the most private act of all. To wake up. To take care of her children. To go to work. To make decisions. to laugh again, to have difficult days, to have good days, and slowly, to discover who she is when nobody else gets to define the story for her. Because perhaps the end of Nicole Kidman's marriage is not the most important thing about her future. Perhaps it is simply their event that forces her to finally ask a deeper question: what does she want the rest of her life to look like? And the answer may be more interesting than anything the tabloids could ever tell us. There is something people often misunderstand about starting over. They imagine that starting over means leaving everything behind. A new home, a new routine, a new identity, maybe even a new relationship. But after 19 years of marriage, Nicole Kidman cannot simply erase the life she built. And perhaps she doesn't want to, because some things are worth keeping, even when the relationship that created them has ended. Her daughters are the clearest example. Sunday Rose and Faith Margaret are not chapters Nicole can close. They are part of her present, and they are part of Keith Urban's present too. That changes the meaning of everything that comes after divorce. Nicole may no longer be Keith's wife, but she will always be connected to him through their children. That means the future cannot be built entirely on separation. It has to be built on a different kind of connection. Co-parenting, boundaries, respect, and above all, an understanding that the children should not be forced to carry the emotional weight of their parents' marriage. That is easier to say than to live. Because adults have memories. They have disappointments. They know things their children may not know. And sometimes the strongest temptation is to explain everything. To tell your side. To make sure everyone understands why you left. But Nicole appears to have made a different calculation. The public does not need every detail. Her daughters need a family they can still recognize. That distinction may become one of the defining features of this next chapter. The marriage is gone. The family is not. And that is a very different kind of ending. It also explains why the word family has appeared so prominently in Nicole's public comments after the divorce. She has spoken about gratitude, about moving toward what is good, about continuing as a family. Those statements may sound carefully chosen, but perhaps that is exactly the point. She knows the consequences of every word. She knows that one sentence can become a headline. A headline can become a social media argument. And eventually, that argument can reach the children. So instead of giving the public a dramatic explanation, she gives them a boundary. This is where the story ends for you. Everything beyond that belongs to us. That is not weakness. It is control. And perhaps Nicole has learned that control is particularly valuable when your private life has been public for most of your adult existence. For decades, the world has been invited to watch her. We watched her relationships. We watched her films. We watched her successes. We watched her disappointments. We watched her become a mother. We watched her marry Keith. And then we watched the marriage disappear. But there is one thing the public can never fully watch. The quiet moments. The moments when the cameras are gone. The conversation between a mother and her daughter. The first night in a changed home. The decision about what to tell the children. The realization that a familiar routine will never feel exactly the same again. Those moments are invisible. And perhaps they are the moments that matter most. Nicole's next chapter will not be defined by one interview. It will be defined by thousands of small decisions. How she handles holidays. How she handles birthdays. How she handles family gatherings. How she responds when her daughters ask difficult questions. How she separates her own feelings from theirs. How she learns to live with the fact that someone who was once beside her every day now occupies a different place in her life. There is no dramatic soundtrack for that. No red carpet. No award. No applause, just life. And perhaps that is why this story has a different emotional quality from the celebrity divorce stories we usually see. There is no obvious finish line. Nicole cannot win a divorce. There is nothing to win. The goal is not to prove that she was right. The goal is to build a life that works. For herself, for her children, and for the future. That requires something she has demonstrated throughout her career: adaptability. Nicole has reinvented herself many times. She has moved between film and television, between acting and producing, between Australia and America, between different kinds of roles and different stages of life. She knows how to enter unfamiliar territory. But personal reinvention is different from professional reinvention. You cannot prepare for it with a script. You cannot rehearse it. And you cannot guarantee the ending. You simply begin, one day at a time. That may be what Nicole is doing now. And there is something else she appears to be carrying with her. Her work. For an actress, work is not simply a paycheck. It can also be a place where identity survives. Before Keith Urban, Nicole was already Nicole Kidman. During the marriage, she remained Nicole Kidman. And after the marriage, she is still Nicole Kidman. That continuity matters. Because when a major relationship ends, people sometimes lose more than the relationship itself. They lose the version of themselves that existed inside it. The routines, the social circle, the shared plans, even the way they introduced themselves to other people. Nicole does not have to rebuild from nothing. She has something that existed before the marriage and survived throughout it. Her work, her creativity, her independence, her ability to tell stories. And perhaps that is one reason she can face the future without needing to immediately replace what she lost. She has another identity to return to. Not as an escape, but as a reminder. She was always more than someone's wife. And now she has their opportunity to live that truth more visibly. But there is a deeper lesson here. Nicole's story challenges the idea that a marriage ending means that the marriage itself was a mistake. That is an incredibly common way of thinking. If something ends, we assume it failed. If a relationship ends, we assume that love was false. If a couple divorces after 19 years, we ask whether their entire 19 years were somehow a lie. But life does not work that way. A chapter can end because it reached its natural conclusion. A relationship can be meaningful without being permanent. And a person can look back on 19 years with gratitude, even while knowing they cannot continue into year 20. That is difficult to explain in a headline, but it may be much closer to reality. Nicole does not need to turn Keith into a villain to justify her future. She does not need to destroy the past to move beyond it. And she does not need to convince strangers that she was right. She simply needs to know it herself. That may be the most private form of strength. Knowing what you need, even when nobody else has all their information. And there is another thing she may have learned. Endurance is not the same thing as happiness. A marriage can survive for years. But survival alone does not tell us what is happening inside it. Some people remain together because they are happy. Others remain because of children, history, fear, habit, hope, responsibility, love, or some combination of all of them. There is no single explanation. And outsiders cannot measure the quality of a marriage simply by looking at its duration. 19 years tells us that Nicole and Keith shared a substantial portion of their lives. It does not tell us everything about those years. That is why the responsible story is not to invent an explanation. It is to acknowledge what is known and respect what remains private. The public knows the marriage ended. The public knows they share 2 daughters. The public knows they reached a legal settlement. And the public has heard Nicole speak about family and moving forward. Beyond that, there are questions. But questions are not facts. And perhaps Nicole's greatest protection is that she understands the difference. She does not have to answer every question simply because people ask it. She does not have to transform private pain into public evidence. She does not have to give strangers the satisfaction of a perfect explanation. Because sometimes there isn't one. Sometimes there are 20 explanations. 100 small moments. Years of choices. Things said. Things left unsaid. Things that changed. Things that never changed. And eventually, a relationship reaches a point where continuing is no longer possible. That is enough. The divorce itself is the evidence that something fundamental had changed. Everything beyond that belongs to the people who lived it. And perhaps this is where Nicole's story becomes something much larger than celebrity gossip. Because millions of ordinary people understand this. They understand that life can change after decades. They understand that children grow. They understand that people who once promised forever sometimes become strangers. They understand the strange feeling of looking at an old photograph and realizing that the people in it were real. But that moment is gone. And they understand that moving forward does not require hating the past. Maybe that is the lesson Nicole is now living. You can keep the memories. Keep the family. Keep the gratitude. Keep the lessons. And still let go of the relationship that no longer works. That is not forgetting. It is acceptance. And acceptance may be the hardest part. Because hope can keep you going for a long time. Hope says maybe things will change. Maybe tomorrow will be different. Maybe one more conversation will fix it. Maybe one more year will bring you back together. But eventually, there comes a moment when hope has to make room for reality. And reality says this is the life I have now. Nicole's challenge is to look at that life and decide that it is still worth living fully. Not someday. Now, with her daughters, with her work, with the people who have remained close, and with whatever future she has not yet imagined. That may be the real meaning of beginning again. Not pretending you were never hurt. Not pretending the past didn't matter. Not pretending that everything is suddenly wonderful. Simply refusing to let one ending become the end of your entire story. Nicole Kidman has spent decades playing characters who face impossible moments. Now she is living one of her own. And unlike a film, there is no final scene waiting to tell her how it turns out. She has to discover that herself. But one thing is already clear. The woman who walks forward from this marriage is not empty-handed. She carries the years. She carries the memories. She carries her daughters. She carries her career. And she carries something perhaps even more important. The knowledge that her identity was never entirely contained inside the marriage. Keith Urban was an important part of Nicole's life. But he was never all of it. And now, she has the chance to decide what the rest of it will be.